I'm delighted to be able to talk to you about Rabbi Dr. Abraham Geiger, someone of whom I suspect many of you have heard, but aspects of whose life you may not be as familiar with. I enjoyed researching this very much indeed, because although my connection with Abraham Geiger is through his work as a liturgist, which I teach at the college, he was a great deal more than just a liturgist. And I'm hoping to give you a flavor of his life, and then towards the end of my time, talk about precisely the work he did on certain prayers that we're all familiar with. And you can see where some of his work in the 19th century is still reflected in our prayer books in the 21st. It's wonderful that we're talking about somebody who was living at a time where a photograph of him could be taken, and I think you get something of the measure of the man. He wasn't particularly tall, but to me, he looks as if he's got one of those indomitable faces that suggests great strength of character. But of course, he didn't start like that. And his beginnings are very interesting. He was born in Frankfurt am Main on the 2nd of May in 1810. And he died in Berlin on October the 23rd, 1874. So you can see he didn't have, and especially, at least by our standards, long life. However, he did live longer than his father, who was Rabbi Michael Lazarus Geiger, and his mother was called Röschen Wallau. And he is buried in the Schönhauser Allee Cemetery in Berlin, which I have visited. And at the end of the talk, I will show you the photograph that I took of his gravestone, and you can see what his community wrote on it, because it's really very touching. Now, Geiger is really first known as one of the key scholars in the new scientific study of Judaism, which started in the early 1800s and was called Das Wissenschaft des Judentums. He was a journal editor, he was a liturgist, and he was a teacher at the Berlin Hochschule, which Leo Baeck also taught at, obviously not at the same time. His early life story is pretty remarkable. By the age of three, he could read German and Hebrew. He started studying Mishnah at the age of 4 and Talmud at the age of 6, under the tutelage of his father, who sadly died just after his bar mitzvah. Alongside that, and unusually for the child of an Orthodox Jewish household, he learned Latin and Greek and history. And when his father died, he gave a drasha at the funeral in Hebrew and German. And I specify that because it upset a lot of his more traditional relatives that the eulogy had been given in 2 languages rather than just Hebrew. Clearly, they didn't quite see it in terms of how incredible it was that someone so young should be able to give a eulogy in 2 different languages. As he grew older, his thoughts about what he wanted to do with his life changed, and he opted to study Oriental philology at university rather than theology, which was what his family had hoped he would do. He studied to start with in Heidelberg, but only for 1 term, during which he mastered Syriac and moved to Bonn to study Arabic. I think you can get a picture here of someone who had great facility with languages. And I don't know the backstory, but my surmise is that he was searching for the right place, thought he'd find it in Heidelberg, didn't, then went to study with a scholar who was on the fringes of academia in Bonn, but was a fine Arabist, And it's intriguing that Geiger was more inspired by his peers than he was by his teachers. Another name which many of you will be familiar with, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was the founder of, we would say the founder of modern Orthodoxy. They were very good friends. They didn't agree pretty much on anything, but they were still very good friends. And they founded a society that was devoted to preaching. And he gave his first sermon there on January the 2nd, 1830. After that, he broadened his studies to take in logic, philosophy, and the classics, and wrote an essay on the Jewish influences on the Quran in Latin, for which he was awarded a prize. I can't help saying that without thinking how much less the rest of us have accomplished in comparison with that. One thing to having learned about Arabic and then write an essay on the Jewish influences on the Quran, and then noch to do it in Latin. In 1832, he became the rabbi in Wiesbaden and became engaged to one Emilia Oppenheim in 1833, though they didn't marry until 1840. While he was in Wiesbaden, in addition to teaching and preaching, he began to make changes to services to enhance their impact on worshippers. He also initiated a new theological review in 1835, which had achieved 4 volumes by 1838, and through which he grew close to Leopold Zuntz, among others. And just as an aside, Leopold Zuntz was really considered to be the founder of Das Wissenschaft des Judentums and a fine scholar of Jewish liturgy, much of whose work has not been bettered since he wrote it in the 19th century. Wiesbaden also saw Geiger bring together a group of rabbis to discuss important aspects of Judaism and its observance. By this time, he was known to have challenging views about traditional Judaism and Jewish practice, which hampered his employability. At Wiesbaden, he introduced some reforms to the services. He cancelled the recitation of medieval piyutim, traditionally said on Tisha B'Av, and removed or altered prayers that he deemed theologically unacceptable. He left the city in 1838, having resigned his position and applied for a position in Breslau. A date was set for him to preach, and the incumbent, one Rabbi S.A. Tichtin, tried to get the police to intervene on the grounds that Geiger was going to preach in German and the Kaiser had not given his permission for this. Nevertheless, the then chief of police, Heinecke, was a free thinker and went to the synagogue to hear Geiger, accidentally on purpose, leaving the denial of permission letter on his desk at the station. The sermon made a huge impact and led to Geiger's appointment as the second rabbi. To stay, he had to become a Prussian citizen, and that caused another controversy to erupt as efforts were made to prevent this happening. But in 1840, he was naturalized and took up his pulpit on the 2nd of January. Tichtin, sadly, continued to machinate against him unsuccessfully, and on his death in 1843, Geiger was promoted to senior rabbi. The synagogue was riven with divisions over Geiger and, familiar story, split in 1856. Those who stuck with Geiger were open to the sort of changes he wanted to make, and in 1859, they adopted the prayer book that Geiger had edited in 1854. Geiger's relations with other leading reformers at the time was awkward, even though his thinking was in line with theirs. But as an historian, he believed in evolutionary rather than revolutionary development. He believed that Judaism had always been on an evolutionary track and that in time, reform would be the mainstream. But he also took issue with some colleagues on specifics, disagreeing, for example, with Rabbi David Einhorn on the election of Israel. His wife, Emilia, died in 1860 after only 20 years of marriage, during which she produced 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. And in 1863, Geiger moved back to Frankfurt am Main, the city of his birth. Although he failed to achieve the directorship of a new Jewish theological seminary, to which he had persuaded a plutocrat called Jonas Frenkel to leave his fortune, in 1870 he gave his inaugural sermon in Berlin. And 2 years later, the Hochschule was opened, and the last 2 years of his life, Geiger happily lectured on the Bible and Wissenschaft. His death, when it came, was quite sudden, coming, in the words of the Jewish Encyclopedia, without premonition, almost literally taking the pen out of his hand. As I said at the beginning, Abraham Geiger was not a tall man, but he dressed stylishly and had a leonine head of hair and strong glasses, which made a big impression on all who saw him. He was also a mesmerizing preacher, always deep thinking and blessed with beautiful diction. Turning now to his writings, the specifics of his literary scholarly output. Geiger was, beyond any question, a scholar rabbi, arguably perhaps more of an academic and thinker than a rabbi, in terms of the relative importance of those roles in his story. While some of us may remember him principally as a reforming rabbi and outstanding liturgist, it is likely that he would have taken greater pride in his academic publications than his liturgical creativity. While in Breslau, he published Lehr- und Lesebuch zur Sprache der Mishnah, a book about the Mishnah, in 1845. In 1847, he published a book on medieval Jewish literature. In 1850, a monograph on Maimonides. In 1855, studies in the history of medieval exegesis and a history of Jewish apologetics. In 1856, a history of Jewish philosophy. And if he had a magnum opus, it was probably his Urschrift und Übersetzung der Bibel, published in 1857, and the backstory of which is quite interesting. Well, you will have seen that pretty much every 2 to 3 years, during a period of obviously extraordinary, intense activity, he published a number of very important books. His output in a short space of time, I find completely staggering. So the book about the Bible, what is the backstory? He started out wanting to write a history of the Karaites, but that then led him into controversies between the Judeans and the Samaritans, and the Sadducees and the Pharisees. This inspired him to identify a growing Jewish religious conscience in the biblical text. He also clarified the facts about the divergences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. For Geiger, the Pharisees were nationalists, the people, the progressists, if I can quote him, an aristocracy of learning and piety. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were what he called the sacerdotalists, the aristocrats, the literalists, And he identified these trends in early rabbinic literature, the Mechilta, Sifra, and Sifrei, as well as different opinions within the Pharisaic yeshivot. It appears that Geiger's ambivalent feelings about Orthodox Judaism first surfaced when he was in his teens, and they then accelerated when he was at university. This may explain why, much to family disapproval, he chose to study philology, Syriac, Hebrew, and classics, taking in lectures on Old Testament, philosophy and archaeology while at Heidelberg, and Oriental languages, philosophy, and theology at Bonn. He found it unacceptable that his lecturers were ignorant of Judaism and often anti-Semitic as well. And so, as you would expect, he distracted himself with studying Arabic and the Quran. Geiger felt that what distinguished Judaism from other faiths was its monotheistic core belief and its ethical system. In comparing the contributions of Greek literature and thought to that of Judaism, he stated that while it was the former's genius that gifted philosophy to Western civilization, it was the Jewish religious genius that enshrined morality in human society. As Professor Susanna Heschel has written, however, Judaism's ethical imperative had been lost in the rigidity of Talmudic legalism, developed over centuries of ghettoization inflicted by Christian intolerance. In the Middle Ages, Jews were better off in Islamic countries than under Christian rule, he argued. Geiger praised Islamic tolerance and the Jews in Islamic Spain as heroes of Wissenschaft, producing poets and philosophers who contributed their work to the general culture by writing in Arabic, not Hebrew. Theirs, he argued, was a pure Judaism, monotheism based on divine revelation, but without the constraints and narrowness of Jewish life within medieval Christendom. Now, logically, I must turn to him and German Reform Judaism. It might be argued that Reform Judaism was as much created by lay people who had abandoned Orthodox praxis and wanted Jewish services to be more like those they encountered in Protestant churches, shorter services, fine choral music accompanied by an organ, and a regular sermon rather than the traditional 2 a year. While it is, I think, wholly appropriate to call Geiger a radical thinker on many aspects of Reform Judaism, he nevertheless tried to create an ideological framework to demonstrate that what the reformers were doing, particularly with regard to liturgy and religious practice, rather than being against something, was responding to the evolutionary processes in Judaism which had always existed. For him, Reform Judaism was reaching back to the time and spirit of the Pharisaic halachic tradition. Now, I mentioned that what is widely considered to be his greatest work was Urschrift und Übersetzung der Bibel in 1857. He argued therein that what the Pharisees intended was nothing less than a liberalization and democratization of halakha in opposition to Sadducee conservatism. Where Geiger went beyond the arguments of others was in his brilliant analysis of the translations of the Tanakh, the Peshitta, the Syriac, the Testament, the Septuagint, the Targum, and also of apocryphal and pseudepigraphical literature to present a picture of 2nd century Temple Judaism as being a battleground between the progressive Pharisees and the reactionary Sadducees. He saw the differences between them, however, as being more partisan or political rather than doctrinal. He wrote that the Pharisaic tradition was nothing other than the principle of continuing further development in accord with the time, the principle of not being slaves to the letter of the Bible, but rather to witness over and over its spirit and its authentic faith consciousness. While we lay claim to Geiger as one of the key figures in the creation and development of our Judaism, we shouldn't ignore the fact that he was also a scholar of Islam and Christianity. And anyone who's interested in following this up should read Susanna Heschel's excellent book, Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus. So what about his liturgical work? It is through his revolutionary work on Jewish liturgy that Geiger has had such influence over the development of progressive Jewish prayer. For those unable or unwilling to access the Gothic script of Geiger's 1854 Gebetbuch, there is the unparalleled scholarship of the late Rabbi Professor Jacob Petachowski in Prayer Book Reform in Europe, the Liturgy of European Liberal and Reform Judaism, published in 1968. Petachowski takes some specific prayers and compares and contrasts how they appear in the various Reform prayer books and the traditional liturgy. It was not just Geiger who was liturgically active. In the 19th century, it seems to have been de rigueur for almost every Reform synagogue to have its own siddur. Indeed, between 1816 and 1845, I counted up no fewer than 22 prayer books that were published. In the preface to his 1870 Israelitisches Gebetbuch, Berlin, Geiger wrote, "The prayer book appearing herewith hardly needs to be commended and introduced to the public for which it is meant. The liturgical question has already for years occupied one of the foremost positions in the consideration of the task of adapting the historical form of Judaism to the demands of the present. The worship service is the bond which binds the congregation. It is meant to be the expression of religious conviction, as alive in the individual as in the group. It must not deny the connection with the totality of the historical past, yet it must at the same time nourish the religious needs of the present." Those were Geiger's words. It is noteworthy how many times Geiger's innovations are found in the liturgies of British liberal Judaism. And while those of you with Siddur Lev Chadash who choose to trawl through the notes for references to Geiger may be frustrated, every time a note says trad modified or trad abridged, the shade of Geiger is likely lurking in the background. Now, what I'd like to do next is to give you an example of what he did with the liturgy. And I tried to do this in a form that could be shared on screen, but using three different texts proved to be too much of a challenge for me to reach the quality that I wanted to show it on screen. And as a result, I said to Alex before I started that if anyone wants a copy of my text and has a good magnifying glass at home, I will be sending it on to her and she will send it out to you, and you can then read through some of the the material. Now, the key exercise when you want to discover what has happened in the evolution of Reform liturgy, you have to start with the traditional liturgy, and you then look to see what has been done with it. And rather wonderfully, Peterkowski didn't just write about the work of the liturgists in Europe. He also gave examples. And so I've selected some of these to share with you. Just to give you an idea of what the thinking was in the early and mid 19th century in Germany about what prayers should be saying, bearing in mind that there was an awareness that Reform Jews were seeking to create a religious and spiritual ambiance where their Christian friends, whose churches they may well have gone to, would feel comfortable. And sometimes, therefore, the contents of prayers that wouldn't necessarily have raised any eyebrows in an Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community needed to be worked on. And the first little prayer that I chose as an example was one of the benedictions of the Shemoneh Esrei, the one that's called Kibbutz Galuyot, the ingathering of exiles. In the traditional version, it says, Takar b'shofar gadol lecherutenu, sound the great horn for our freedom, v'sanes lekabetz galuyotenu, and raise high a flag to gather our exiles. V'kabtzenu yachad, and gather us together, may arba kanfot haaretz, from the four corners of the earth. Baruch atah Adonai, makabetz nidchei amo Yisrael. We praise you, O God, who gathers in the dispersed of his people, Israel. Now, interestingly enough, Geiger had two stabs at some of these prayers, but not this one. He clearly was happy with what he did with 1854. And he said, and if you get the text, you'll be able to follow this through again. He said, Takar b'shofar gadol lecherutenu, so far, so much in common. But then he went on, V'hosha Adonai et amcha, and free or save your people, et she'erit Yisrael, the remainder of Israel, be'arba kanfot haaretz, in the four corners of the earth. Baruch atah Adonai, Moshiach she'erit amo Yisrael, who saves the remainder of his people Israel. And it's quite subtle in a way, and you may say, so what? What does it say? But it doesn't talk about people, Jews, living in places, as it were, temporarily. They're living there, and they need to be protected there. And so there is a recognition of a reality. And in the version that is in Siddur Lev Chadash, and I may say, for all of you who are members of Reform communities, there is plenty of Geiger there too. The challenge is that because there are no notes at the end of the liturgies, it's very difficult to check things out in the book itself. So the Lev Chadash version says, Takar b'shofar gadol lecherutenu, so they all have that in common. V'sanes liftot ashukenu, and raise a flag to redeem our oppressed. V'kol dror yishama be'arba kanfot haaretz, and the voice of freedom, let it be heard in the four corners of the earth. Baruch atah Adonai podei ashukim, we praise you, O God, who redeems the oppressed. Now that is sort of thematically close to what Geiger was doing, but it's also different. And you can see from that his influence may be quite subtle and difficult to ascertain. And that's where one has to compare and contrast. So the second one, this is where I'm going to get myself into terrible confusion with the different texts. The second one that I wanted to look at, and forgive me making lots of noise, is the benediction, which is about judges. Now, in Lev Chadash, the prayer says, Hoshiva shoftei tzedek betoch b'nei amecha, let righteous judges sit in the midst of your people, v'yoatzei shalom, and counselors of peace, b'chol tevel artzecha, throughout the whole world. Ve'az, and then, timloch aleinu atal levadecha, b'chesed u'v'rachamim, and then you will reign over us alone in loving kindness and compassion. Baruch atah Adonai melech ohev tzedakah u'mishpat. But the traditional one says, Hashiva shoftenu kevarishona, restore our judges as at the first. V'yoatzenu kevatchila, and our counselors at the beginning. V'haser mimenu yagon v'anacha, and remove from us anguish and distress. U'maloch aleinu ata Adonai levadecha b'chesed u'v'rachamim, and then reign over us, you, O God, alone, in loving kindness and compassion. V'tzadkenu b'mishpat, and judge us justly. Baruch atah Adonai melech ohev tzedakah u'mishpat. And it's that seems very clearly to be speaking the language of some sort of semi-messianic restoration of when we had sovereignty over all aspects of our lives, and particularly mentioning the courts. Now, Geiger had two stabs at this in 1854 and then in 1870. And it's pretty subtle. But in the 1854 version, he said, Hashiva lanu sason yishecha, restore us to the joy of your salvation, v'ruach nediva tismachenu, and may a noble spirit support us, v'haser mimenu, and then he went on as in the traditional. And then in 1870, slightly different, Hashiva lanu sason yishecha, u'mishpatenu milfanecha yetzei, and let our judgment come from before you. Now, he was trying to make, I think, a point there about the degree of susceptibility that Jews living in Europe in his time had to hostile legal structures. So benediction at number 12 is quite a significant one because it's called Birkat Haminim, which is the sectarian's blessing. And it's in its traditional version, it's about informers. And it says in the tradition, V'la malshinim al tehi tikva, let there be no hope for slanderers. V'chol harish'a kerega toved, and may you destroy all wickedness in an instant. V'chol oivecha mehera yikaretu, and may all your enemies be speedily cut off. Umalchut zadon, and the boastful rule, mehera te'aker, may you speedily uproot it, uteshaber, and break it, utemager, and smash it, v'tachnia b'mehera v'yameinu, and humble it speedily in our days. Baruch atah Adonai shover oivim umachnia zedim. We praise you, O God, who smashes enemies and humbles the proud. Well, I think you can probably see why there might be a need to do something with that. So in 1854, Geiger came up with something really rather clever. Instead of saying v'la malshinim, he said v'la malshinut, which is not talking about people who spread gossip and lies and slander, but about slander itself. So he read, v'la malshinut al tehi tikva, and may there be no hope for slander, v'chol harish'ah kerega toved, and may you destroy in a moment all evil. V'hazadon tachnia bimhera v'yameinu, and may you bring pride low speedily in our days. Baruch atah Adonai, we praise you, O God, shover harish'ah, who breaks evil, umachnia hazadon, and brings low the arrogant. And one wonders when you see a variation like that, what, if anything, specifically he was thinking about, whether he was thinking about regional governments or the Prussian government or whatever. And when that comes into Siddur Lev Chadash, to sort of filtered through other disciples of Geiger, it comes out as follows: V'larish'ah al tehi tikva, may there be no hope for evil. V'hatoim elecha yashuvu, may those who stray from you return. Umalchut zadon mehera ta'avir, and may you cause all tyranny to pass away. Baruch atah Adonai hama'avir resha min haaretz. We praise you, O God, who causes wickedness to disappear from the world. And that, what you may wonder, that where does that phrase v'hatoim elecha yashuvu, where does that come from? Well, in 1870, Geiger altered his version of this benediction, and he included the phrase v'hatoim elecha yashuvu, and may all those who have strayed from you return to you. So even in a very small way, Geiger's work in the first half of the 19th century continues to influence us. One of the things that Geiger undoubtedly stood for was a sense that what he was doing, as many of us who've grown up as Reform and liberal Jews, I'm sure also believe, that our Judaism is wholly part of the evolutionary nature of Judaism itself. And that is exactly what Geiger thought. Now, I said that he was buried in the Schönhauser Allee cemetery, and I'm going to terrorize Alex by asking her to show the photo that I took when I visited there in 2005. So it says, Die jüdische Gemeinde Berlin, ihrem unvergesslichen Lehrer und Führer, dem Rabbiner Dr. Abraham Geiger. So they called him their unforgettable teacher and leader, Rabbi Dr. Abraham Geiger. He was an extraordinary man. He was a polymath, but above all, he wanted to make the religion that he had inherited meaningful in his time and for time to come. And I have to say, I think he succeeded very largely in those endeavors. And that concludes my spoken bit, and I'm happy to turn now to some questions that have been put into the chat.
Whether there was already an existing tradition of changing traditional liturgy, or was Geiger an innovator in doing that?
If you study Jewish liturgy, the first thing you discover is there's no such thing as a Jewish liturgy. There are Jewish liturgies. There were liturgies that were in origin from Babylon to Britain and all the countries in the Mediterranean basin, in North Africa, and all the countries in Europe that you can think of. They often all had their own specific rite. We tend to say these days there was an Ashkenazi rite and there was a Sephardi rite, but actually there were a number of different Sephardi rites, and there were certainly plenty of Ashkenazi ones. And gradually, of course, I suppose, largely because of the very fact of printing, they became more standardized, and the variations, the key variations between, say, Jewish communities in Provence, in France, in Provence, and in Izmir in Turkey, became more the same, and certainly in Northern Europe, the Ashkenazi ones did too. So what I think Geiger was saying was, I recognize that there is considerable room within Jewish liturgy to decide on something that isn't necessarily the version in this prayer book, but might be in another prayer book. And so I think for that reason, he was following on something that had always been the way. There had always been different rites. The difference was that this was not a different rite based on geography. It was based on a growing ideology and theology.
Thank you. So, following on this, Simon Montague is asking whether Geiger's work was entirely derived from the Ashkenazi tradition, or whether he introduced elements from the Sephardic Siddur.
To the best of my knowledge, and I emphasize that because my knowledge is far from infinite in these matters, but to the best of my knowledge, he was really focused on the Ashkenazi liturgical tradition in his time. Doesn't mean he wasn't aware of it, because Leopold Zuntz, whose scholarship Geiger was very influenced by, he had himself studied both Sephardi and Ashkenazi liturgy. So he would have had an awareness from his relationship with Zuntz and his reading of Zuntz's works.
Thank you. Rabbi Charles, do you know if any early British Reform Jews would have had contact with Geiger?
Well, I must say, I don't know who asked that question, but it's a lovely question, because it's something that I've also long wondered. One of the marvelous things about Petachowski's book is that you're going along, you're looking at the different versions, and it's 1819 Hamburg and 18 something else somewhere else, and then suddenly you see West London Synagogue 1841, traditional Sephardi version, Hebrew and English. So you see that David Wolfe Marks and his colleague Reverend Lowy, who created the first forms of prayer liturgies for the West London Synagogue of British Jews, they would have been well aware of what was going on in Germany. I would like to think, but I haven't looked to see whether there are any records, but I would like to think that they were in touch with each other. And I mean, one of the things that I've discovered as a result of working on liturgy now for many, many years is that liturgies do influence each other, sometimes without the people working on them necessarily being that aware of it. So there is this sort of almost rolling process with Jewish liturgy, and I think it's a source of great pride that the first Reform prayer book came out in 1841. I mean, it was pretty early. There were plenty of others that were later, and it crops up a lot in Petachowski's book.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from Howard Cohen as well, who says, I'm aware he censored his private views on radical reform in his public positions, for example, the circumcision reform. Any thoughts on what this tells us about the nature of the man?
Thank you, Howard, for that. I really appreciate it. It's a very good question that I can have a theory about rather than give you a specific answer, because it's not something that I know. But I very much have the feeling that Geiger was much, much more of a pragmatist than a number of his rabbinic colleagues and contemporaries, who were probably much more extreme and didn't really mind about upsetting the apple cart. And I think that Geiger would have been more inclined not to be less radical, but to manage his radicalism in a different way and to promote it in a different way. And as I hope I sort of got across, his reforming Judaism was organic and evolutionary. And I think you have to have a sense of trust and a sense of hope in the future if you feel that you don't have to do all the work, but you can actually do part of it that will make it the next step for the next generation easier to do. And I think so. I wouldn't, if he was more of a pragmatist, I personally would be keen to applaud him for that rather than to criticize him.
So Howard saying thank you, very helpful. One last question, actually, from Anthony, who asked whether Geiger was influenced by Samson Raphael Hirsch.
He must have been, because they were friends as well as contemporaries. But remember, Hirsch was a traditionalist, but in a quite a radical new way. And I suspect it was those sorts of things that he and Geiger would have had in common, even though the end result that they wanted would have been very different. Just to sort of add, thank you to all of you for giving up an hour of your evening to come and listen to me waffle on. When the list came round and I was asked to do one of these sessions, I was at first deeply disappointed to see that someone else was doing, oh, Ofra, how lovely to see a message from you. I was very disappointed to see that someone else had bagged John Rayner. And then I thought to myself, come on, you always talk about John Rayner. And John, I once asked him how he got into liturgy. And he gave me a wonderful answer. He said, it was in the late 1950s, he said, and someone asked me a question that I didn't know the answer to. And so I started to investigate it. And that's how I began to study Jewish liturgy. So as his mantle, his mantras are very much in my mind on a very regular basis. I followed that and I chose to do Geiger, and I'm very glad I did.
And we are delighted that you did as well, obviously. Thank you so much, Rabbi Charles, and thank you all of you for being here. There are many messages on how interesting and wonderful this was. So thank you, and good evening, everyone.